You were absolutely right. One day I'll become a person whose life is worthy of a diary. Long gone are the times when I would not believe a single word you were telling me. Remember how I was constrained by the idea that my life was just a shadow of what other people live? Yes, I was that introspective rat who kept thinking of its own experience as too modest and unworthy of a page. Walking home, along the canal and observing dancing lights in bar windows. I would muse about the polymorphous people inside. They were drinking and chasing marvelous scenarios of the infinite night. Their lives were as colorful as those red lanterns outside. Fatalist, inflated and singular. I would never open the doors of those places, though. I knew I had to go home and sit at my writing desk. Yet what I was facing at the desk was the same walk I just had along the canal. Boring as that canal is, I'm not going to call it by its name. You kept encouraging me to believe in my own life, regardless of my desire to invent another. To live la vie fantastique instead. And this is something I kept doing relentlessly. Each day was filled with all kinds of imaginary characters and vicarious tropes. One of them had just come back from the park and showed a picture of himself in the stomach of the turtle. Just imagine, he said. It looked so grainy and gross. Another one used to collect watches found inside time bombs. Why time bombs, I wondered. He burped. Time explodes. I still remember his voice. Low and manic, though communicating the truth. Then there was a man who could tell his whole life story in a couple of hours. He would always finish at 5 a.m. with his mustache burning due to the speed of his words. An hour later, a woman would wake up in her wedding night bed and start doing yoga exercises. On the way to her office, she would have coffee in a place that had just opened a month ago. "Are your beans fair trade?" she would ask a waiter, and hurry some sugar into her cup before receiving an answer. 2 spoons, usually. What a sweet tooth. A man across the bar sued her because he was convinced that the woman's character was based on his own life. Same amount of sugar, same social concerns, same office. I will never come back to that body I left in jail. I'm free now and I want you to be free too, he would say. I'm a rabbit and a hat, she would respond. But no one has ever come close to a person who thought he was a book written without an author. To complement the existence of this thinker, there was a woman who entertained a fantasy of being a writer. She would never write a single line, only stare at me gleefully as though I was jealous of her not writing and yet still being a writer. What an insinuator. I've never been introduced to the man of bad analogy, but I've been told that he was very good at bad analogies. The fellow would always speak with some kind of comparison, choosing the most abstract entity in the room and setting it alongside something more familiar. Singing in the rain is like singing in the rain, he would say. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Heaven only knows. A similarly debilitating character was ardently involved in totalization exercises. What would happen if all the people who ever died came back to life today? What would be the total hair length of all the people living in New York? What would be the size of a gate through which all mankind could walk in one step? He would not stop asking. When digital visualization tools became available for nerds like these, their lives went in full swing. I should not forget to mention that the woman who sang every night in a choir of vocoders had a husband who was ready to pay all of his savings to have sex behind one of the O's in the Hollywood sign. With anybody. Everybody waited for this to happen. But no one really wanted to crawl behind the O. Maybe the W? A French-speaking neighbor suggested. But this alternative was not discussed further. A neighbor's tattoo was mesmerizing enough for me to ask, "Is that real?" The expression on his face made me understand what a silly question that was. "Of course it's real," he said. Trying to improve the situation, I stepped back. "It looks more than real." "No, it is real." He hit a table with his fist. All these characters usually spoke in 1 or 2 sentences, no more. Usually the sentences were of paradoxical nature and generated by a pathological element at the core of the character's identity. At times I was tempted to write from the perspective of these characters. At other times, just from their thoughts, but somehow with no subjectivity attached. For example, once I wrote a letter from the perspective of a man who thought he was an abstract shape, suspended in a flow of circumstances. He could move back and forth, up and down, left and right, but always remained flat, a sort of two-dimensional contemporary Don Quixote merged with the mill that he approached. This man reminded me of Carl André's saying that an artist makes an artwork like a pear tree yields a pear. Or was it an apple tree? In any case, I've decided to write a text from his perspective. Not André's or the apple trees. From the perspective of this abstractoid, which was a synthesis of the author and his artwork seen from a distance. This synthesis looked like a singular shape. "It's a space of fantasy," you said. "You should look at the people around you. They are no less polymorphous." The following day you told me to kill all of my characters and write a book of their obituaries. The book that belongs to no one and is not needed by anyone, so you said. It was a difficult task, but it gave me good reason to focus. I have executed the characters one by one. No need to go into detail. To cut a long story short, the French-speaking neighbor met his end behind the letter O, and the adulterous husband was finished off behind the W. Long live the anagrams, and I waved them goodbye and moved on to work on the book of obituaries. Once the book is completed, it will be published as a limited edition. You will get one copy. While I was working on the book, a bag of seeds arrived by mail. It was deadly nightshade, an extremely poisonous plant whose berries serve as a basis for atropine, which can induce hallucinations, as long as you don't take too much. In medicine, atropine is used as an antidote to other poisonous substances. One of atropine's most interesting effects is allowing one eye to zoom in while the other one zooms out. We've tried it with my mother a few times. At least in the moments when she looked like my mother. I didn't know what to do with the bag. There was no manual enclosed. One day, when I was in Palermo, I took the seeds with me to an old botanical garden. At that time of the year, this 18th century garden stood green and orange and empty. Among the more curious specimens to be seen in the garden were bottle trees, or false kapok, forming a long avenue, the soap tree, false cinnamon, coffee, sycamore, the delicate mimosa, and various palm trees, including sabal and chamerops. The most magnificent specimen was Ficus magnoliodes. I thought about how great it would be to hold a vocoder choir concert in it. Indeed, because of the lack of visitors, this garden also featured a range of sounds. Pine cones falling down, birds suddenly squirming among the leaves, tangerines rolling across the path, the whole sonic botanical garden. In the aquarium, turtles were touching the surface of the water from the other side. More precisely, they were touching the surface of the air, very cautiously, as though it were deeper than the pond they were in. There was also a snail I would see in passing every day, on the stone by the fountain. One day I thought it was dead, because it kept sitting there in the same position. When I went to check if that was true, the snail was no longer there. I understood that this must have been a sign. The next day you asked me to show some signs of a turn of thought. I was always a bit skeptical of claims that a writer could show how the mind works. Exposing the apparatus of drives and contradictions are unresolved elements covering the construction of the everyday was not my task. It happens anyway, especially when one does not think or thinks too much. No need to apply the findings of cognitive analysis in reverse. Nevertheless, this request prompted me to write a diary. My thought, "How are you?" was the first thing I said. And then the thought replied, "I'm okay. How are you?" This was the moment when I understood that something had happened. My thoughts don't belong to me anymore. They come from somewhere else, but they also include me. I started to dig deeper. I realized that we can only think about abstract things because we understand them in terms of concrete spatial experience. Thought itself, conceptualization, interpretation, reasoning. It is just such an abstraction. One that can only be thought about in terms of metaphor. We imagine our mind as a space within which ideas are created and housed. We imagine it as a conduit through which ideas are conveyed to other people. We imagine ideas as people, plants, and turtles and commodities. We imagine understanding as seeing or grasping. Though it is conceptualized in terms of a number of different concrete spatial metaphors, and we cannot conceive of it without them. We can be conscious of these spatial metaphors, but they can also work unconsciously to structure thought. My whole notion of thinking changed at the moment I applied a different spatial paradigm. Thought is neither an autonomous, monadic entity with sharp outlines, nor it is a cloud, but it can be found in both of these alternatives. It is sovereign now, both on the surface and under the water. Even if I killed all these characters, their lives were part of me. Even if I didn't know that Domenico Modugno was singing Volare for Yves Klein, blue was painted on blue. Ne bleu dipinito di bleu. The next day you asked me to replace the old, dried leaves used as bookmarks in one of the books in a library with a leaf I had torn off of a coffee tree in Lina Bobardi's glass house in Sao Paulo. It was one of my favorite houses ever. Calm and infused with volume. There were also a couple of turtles roaming around. Lina had supposedly bought them back from Bahia. But maybe I can skip the turtles this time. The task of replacing these leaves in the book was obviously futile, but since you didn't tell me which book in the library to look for, it turned into a much more exquisite adventure. Browsing through books in the library in search of a single leaf, I found many interesting meanings. To be honest, meanings replaced the leaf, or rather the two were constantly switching places. Seeing all of those leaves spread out on the table, one inevitably wished to animate them, to invent stories in which they turned into synodogic characters. This temptation, the very mechanism of fantasy, is familiar if we think of childhood games. A little boy plays for days constructing a labyrinth of roads for a toy truck that, through the visible excuse of this elaborate project, is left aside the whole time. The object having fulfilled its signifying role is free to disappear. Surely a truck toy does not signify a road, and that is precisely the point, said one of the pages of the picture exhibition catalogue I found in the library. Surely a truck does not signify a road or a toy. It simply follows a train of thought. A truck follows the train, a train is a thought is a train. What if it stops here? Let me tell you a few more things that may reshuffle the cards at this very moment, when we are ready to go back to where we came from. Maybe it will change your destination. I did everything you asked me to do, and even more. I started to collect museums. I started to collect extended moments of dullness, not only the magic moments. I started retyping articles and changing them in such a way that even their authors would not recognize them. If they recognized them, they would give up their authorship. started to follow 4 thoughts at the same time. I became interested in the time when we were not yet separate from things and words. I vomited when I experienced what it felt like. I will do it again. I stopped experimenting with radical physical experiences, thinking that they would result in another language. I've decided to experiment with language, thinking it will make another experience of life possible. I stopped blindly believing in change. It didn't stop, though. I stopped fetishizing broken thoughts, yet I stopped fearing that the train has no destination. I've decided that I will belong to my personal history, regardless of how entangled that history becomes with others. I became more interested in the path of thought, and the body and their movements rather than individual moments in the path. I became more interested in ways of arriving at an idea, rather than isolating the idea itself. You can reach an idea from the inside of a tangerine or the outside of a turtle, and it will be different each time. I started to avoid the twist at the end. I started to limp. Usually this would happen when walking, obviously. Remember how verbal Clint limps in Usual Suspects? At the end of the film, he leaves the police office, walks down the street, and slowly his legs find another pattern, a rhythm we haven't seen before in the film. What did you think of it? Did you think it was a moment when Kevin Spacey erased the character? No, not only. I can tell you confidently, it is also a moment when someone is cured. Limping for hours, feverishly through space, as though it were a vacuum. I turned back suddenly. Behind me a large threshold was looming. A gate in the middle of nowhere. Like one of those gates in the desert that you can only see once you look back. You suddenly notice this portal in the air that you've just passed through. A disconnected architectural structure of Magritian logic as seen from Tereskova's illuminator. It indicated that I'd entered another space. A space of 4 different alternate realities. This is your day, you said. Now you have to write about it. But that day felt too great for me to have the slightest interest in wasting it on the writing desk. The more my life was becoming worthy of a diary, the less I wanted to write about it. I was walking further away from this gate, and my legs were finding a straight line, another rhythm, another pattern, another meaning. I've seen the future, and it will be. I've seen the future, and it works. I never told you that I left one of the characters alive.